So mental health and working with gangs and youth violence, understanding the impact of mental ill health and the trauma on young people in gangs. I think quite often we forget that young people actually go through some horrific things, a lot more than I went through as a young person, quite adult things, but they don't always have the vocabulary to express. So that's what we're going to be exploring. So lesson 1, objectives, we're going to be looking at the key criterions of 1 and 2. So defining the term mental health. Hopefully you all have an idea of what mental health means to you individually. We're going to also look at explaining the risk to young gang members and violent young people developing mental health conditions. So all of those ACEs, all of those things, the contextual, environmental, behavioural, all of those things that impact and kind of lead towards us coping with unhealthy strategies, identifying relationships between gang affiliation, mental well-being. So I think I've heard some of you say about schools, we talk about exclusion, fostering, kids in care, all those sorts of things, all those ACEs are potentially going to be triggers for young people and lead to complications in their adult life as well. Explaining the signs and symptoms of mental health issues in a violent or gang-related environment as well, okay? Lesson 3 objectives are to explain the impact of violence and trauma on individuals in a violent or gang-related environment, and we'll break it all down as well, and explaining the impact of mental ill health on individuals, families and communities, so those that are impacted by gangs and youth violence, directly, indirectly, and all those ripple effects. We're going to also explain how mental health affects some groups more than others. Okay, so the definition of mental health, I've got a couple of definitions because I think it's really useful to sort of like look at some softer sort of versions. Mental health, or the language, can be quite clinical. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, they define it as mental health being an integral and essential component of health. The WHO Constitution states that health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So if we are experiencing depression and we are in a well state, it doesn't mean just because there's the absence of that mental health is positive. There also needs to be the social aspects, which often isn't considered when we're looking at just addressing mental health with a medical model. It's an important implication of the definition that mental health is more than just the absence of disorders. That is really key. A lot of people may struggle to accept their diagnosis, so may live their lives like they don't have disorders. So the acceptance of one doesn't necessarily mean people that will live their day-to-day lives responding to their disorder. So mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, but can cope with normal stresses of life, can work productively and be able to make a contribution to his or her community. What do we think about that definition? The Department of Health explain it as the emotional and spiritual resilience which enables enjoyment of life and the ability to survive pain, disappointment and sadness. It is a positive sense of well-being and an underlying belief in our own and others' dignity and worth. The NHS, so they say it's in the national no health without mental health policy, and that it's a positive state of mind and body, feeling safe and able to cope with a sense of connection with people, communities and the wider environment. What do we think about those two? Key things to remember is that when we're addressing mental health from a public service point of view, it's generally the medical model. Key things that impact that are staffing, funding. Mental health is probably one of the least funded services within the NHS, but we know it's needed. Someone mentioned earlier about not wanting to rely so much on CAMHS and statutory services. The Good Child Report 2021, they said within the next 3 to 5 years, as a direct result of COVID-19, there would be 1.5 million children that would need mental health support. But actually, children that were going to CAMHS were being told they are not sick enough to access the service. So we've actually got a placement in my old secondary school where we deliver a counselling project. So we train counsellors, we try to enable them to be culturally competent, and we give them skills, training, and try to round their knowledge so they don't just come out with a degree in counselling where they've had no practical experience. And I think it's really, really important to understand that even schools, the resources that were taken out, they're now trying to put back in, but there is a deficit everywhere you go, where young people should be supported around their mental health. Mental health, an alternative definition. So this was one that I developed when I was doing my module. So malhealth, as in the mal as in the deficiency of, so if you think of malnutrition, or the unwell state of a person's cognitive health, potentially the deprivation of or excess elements that could create an imbalance in the state of a healthy cognitive well-being, with potential impact on the physical, mood, behavior, or emotional elements of a human being. For example, insomnia, the mind and body's deprivation of sleep. What do you think of that one? What do we think about the definition? Clinical, does it capture the essence of? I think what I tried to do here was change the language. Mental is quite stigmatic. Malhealth or malnutrition, people seem to go along with. But basically, when we experience poor mental health, we often experience the deficiency of a good quality of life. Sometimes we're unable to get out of bed and go to work. Sometimes we're unable to engage socially. Our diet is impacted. Our finances then start to impact our emotions, our well-being. So it's the deficiency of all of those things that creates and contributes. What do you think is probably one of the most socially acceptable way of potentially developing mental health? Socially acceptable. What are the sorts of things we do when we go out to socialize?
Talk, discuss, socialize.
Socialize. What else?
Share information.
Share information.
Talk about feelings and concerns.
Habits.
Substance misuse.
Substance misuse. Most common, alcohol.
Yeah.
Alcohol.
Alcohol. It is probably it's the most common. It's more socially acceptable, which is one that is probably drawn to in terms of dealing with and masking what's going on. You go out and you say you're having a drink, people aren't really going to question it, are they? It's something that can be done quite discreetly, but actually it can be very, very impactful on mental health. So PERIVACEs. So we're looking here at adverse childhood experiences, but also from a community perspective. Let's just explore maternal depression. Maternal depression, someone who's maybe experienced pregnancy and had a traumatic birth, that could be really, really impacting if a mother doesn't bond with the baby because of that traumatic experience. Emotional and sexual abuse, again, those sorts of ACEs, and the more number of ACEs that a person will experience, the longer they experience them, will determine the different types of outcomes as adults, how they cope using behaviours. Within the home environment, if adults are coping with drugs and alcohol, it then becomes a much more socially acceptable way of coping. So children are more likely to then start dealing with those ways. Pick out some of them and let's just explore. Homelessness, I'll start with that one. when we see homeless people, how do we respond? Speak from your own personal perspectives. How do we respond in terms of homeless people? Do we have an understanding of where they are? Do we ask?
I naturally help the women sometimes, and then the men, I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but initial reaction is like, oh, women help men. No, you got yourself there.
So you're more likely to help the women than the men? Was that correct?
Oh, sorry. Yes, yeah.
Okay. So again, what we're saying there is that there's almost a gender bias. For whatever reason, you'd be more prone to help or be more accepting of a homeless person if they were a female. Is that because of your gender, or do you think there are other factors in that?
I think because of my own gender, yes,
Okay.
definitely. But also, I think, yes, my own gender. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So homeless, I met a lady. We do some walkabout groups as part of a parents and carers group with Empower You. And I asked her to share her story with me. And I always see her and I always stop. I'll give her water, I'll give her a bit of change or buy her something from the shop. And she explained that during COVID-19, she was living with her partner and there was domestic violence going on within the relationship. And when she dialed 999, because his name was on the lease, she was asked to leave, and that was the journey of her becoming homeless. So when we see homeless people, we are never 100% sure what their story is, but actually there's a saying that you're about 2 pay slips away from being homeless. What do we think about the lack of opportunity, economic mobility and social capital? Take your mics off. So the criteria we are trying to meet is we are explaining the risks to young people, gang members, and violent young people of developing mental health conditions. So thinking of the young people that you work with that maybe have that lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital. So what we're talking about is marginalization. We're talking about layers and layers of intersectionality, all of these different things that are impacting these young people, whether it's race, whether it's that they come from a background where parents have a lower level of education. That's one of the indicators for poverty. The number of people that maybe live in that household, that's another measure of poverty. So in response to 1.2, what are the risks for some of the young people that you work with? Let me know your name, because I'm just making sure I'm marking who is giving me responses, because you're actually answering the criteria.
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. Sorry, who's speaking?
Steve.
Steve. Sorry, Steve, I can't see when my screen's like this. So peer pressure, what could that peer pressure trigger in that young person? When we're considering mental health, what kind of physiological, emotional response might it trigger for that young person?
I think it puts them on in a situation whereby it's a flight or flight situation. Example being, if I follow my peers and listen to my peers, I'll be accepted, and if I don't, I won't be accepted, and I'll be on my own, so to speak.
Yeah. So maybe anxiety about fitting in, those peer pressures, already maybe feeling that you don't fit in because of your social circumstances. If that young person is then experiencing that fight or flight, so what we're saying is they are on a constant state of maybe anxiety, that means increased cortisol, so the stress hormone, potentially the anxiety that's going with it. What's the potential for that young person in terms of if they are in school, any academic attainment? What's one of the possible outcomes for them?
Yeah, they'll possibly be excluded, won't they, based on the behaviour? If you're constantly in that fight or flight, you're more likely to be very reactive, and your responses would be exaggerated, and with no context that they can see, teachers might not be able to understand why you're behaving that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So young person who is maybe being bullied, experiencing peer pressure to maybe fit in, might do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do. If a teacher is responding, what I often hear from teachers is they've been displaying behaviours. And I'll say, okay, tell me about the behaviours. And I'll say, okay, so tell me what's been going on for the young person. Quite often, young people can respond. For example, a young person who is experiencing depression might respond in, like you've said, flipping the chair, flipping the table. Some of the key things going on with them is that they may not even have the emotional intelligence to understand how they feel, let alone to be able to verbally communicate it. Young people that are maybe experiencing depression might be labelled as lazy. I've had conversations with teachers where I've gone back and I've said, you know, that's not language I want to hear. We know they're experiencing mental health. We know depression is part of it. Some of the symptoms are that they will maybe be quite lethargic. They might go to sleep, but actually experience insomnia. They might struggle to recall things and therefore may not be retaining a lot in lessons and might use disruption as a mask. Yeah. So community disruption, poor housing quality and affordability and violence, key thing, and the course that you're doing. So gangs and youth violence, how might that impact a young person? So again, we're trying to explain the risk to young gang members and violent young people of developing mental health. How might someone who's involved, either as a victim, from a vicarious element, so viewing what's happening in terms of the gang and youth violence, how might a young person be impacted in their mental health?
Some of the things they might see would, you know, cause trauma or be traumatic for them.
Absolutely. They're traumatic for adults. So for young people, especially, a high exposure of those sorts of things. And again, you've got social media. So sometimes they are just watching these things online, being sent videos and having that experience of that secondary trauma, that vicarious trauma. So pervasive, you really need to think about the adverse childhood experiences that are at home. So parents experiencing mental health and what that might mean for young people, with their abuse, physical abuse as well, maybe potentially neglect, or young people actually becoming carers for their younger siblings. Key things to really think about when we think of young people potentially going out, being involved in gangs and thinking they need to be the breadwinner because parents aren't doing what society says they should be doing. All right. So we've just been answering 1.2. And again, we're just going to have a look on the window of the world. So people's frame of references are built on various different things. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share a bit of a window on the world in terms of my frame of reference. And then I'm going to ask a couple of you to maybe share 2 or 3 things to share the frame of reference on why you view things the way you do and why you respond the way you do. So imprinting years, for me, really important for attachment. I was 4 years old when my stepdad came into my life, and he had been in my life until he passed away in 2019. He was the only man that I called dad. Education wise, when I was younger, I left school, got pregnant quite early, but then had a later life in terms of education. What I know now in terms of mental health was certainly not what I knew then, but my experience in terms of education and cultural influences in terms of mental health were key reasons why I do what I do now. So cultural influences in terms of mental health. Growing up, we used to have a cousin, and my mum, or well, not just my mum, the whole family used to refer to him as Mad and then his name. And that was normal. We would see like Lester, this man that lived within the community riding his bike, and everyone knew that he had mental health. It was something that wasn't really socially acceptable and quite stigmatic. From a mental health point of view, at 9 years old, I was impacted. My brother was stabbed, survived that stabbing, and it took 6 years. He was 18 at the time. was about 24 when he was given a diagnosis of bipolar affective disorder. Those life experiences in terms of my window on the world are a direct determinant for what I do today. So when you think about the people that you are supporting, certain things within their lives will have had a direct impact to how they present to you with the support needs that they have. And that's really, really important to understand. So I want a couple of you to maybe give me 2 or 3 examples of some of those areas and how you apply them to your frame of reference.
Can I come in here? Obviously, I've spoke about my dad.
Yeah.
But what I learned from my dad, I'm working with a young lad now.
Yeah.
And he's got ADHD.
Yeah.
He's been in care since he was 10.
So disability. Yeah.
He started smoking cannabis, and
Yeah.
he told me the story of how he ended up in care. So
Wow.
his mum was an alcoholic and his
Yeah.
dad died. So
Yeah.
because his mum was an alcoholic, he ended up in care.
Yeah.
And he ran away from the home,
Yeah.
hoping that somebody'd look for him, because if he came from a lovely home, it'd all be
Yeah.
on the news, but nobody ever came looking for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he went through all that, and so he's quite angry, he's quite hurt, and he's quite strong in lots of other things. You know, he's ended up securing his own accommodation
Oh, well done.
because
Yeah.
his PA that should have been looking after him
Yeah.
didn't. So obviously we've got a lot of wraparound support that we can
Yeah,
do within
yeah.
probation, and linked him in with them services, and he just carried on bidding and bid, got knocked down after knockdown after knockback,
Yeah.
and then he's eventually got his own supported accommodation where he's going to be allocated a key worker. But he said it was the fact that I didn't judge him. He is quite immature. He
Yeah.
does sulk and does a lot of other stuff. But
Yeah.
I understand and get where he's
Yeah.
coming from. And he said no one's ever supported him like that before within the social care system.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I think that's because of what I've learned as a young
Yeah.
person growing up.
Absolutely.
I don't want no one
Yeah.
to suffer, and I'll ensure that he doesn't.
Yeah.
But he
Your
has to.
approach. Sorry, Caroline, go on.
He has to stand up and be counted as well, and be responsible for his own actions.
Absolutely.
But he got involved in drugs, and everybody else got custodial sentence. He got an SSO, which is a suspended sentence. But you could see that he was very vulnerable. He was easy pickings, and it was all going on in his home, and he didn't have a clue that that was wrong.
Cool.
And now he does, obviously, because he's had a punitive order where he's had to comply and stand up to, this is what happens when you do something wrong, and this is what I have to do, and he's doing what he has to do because the courts have instructed that to him. But it's a massive learning curve for him, and you can see his confidence has grown. His self-esteem's grown. So there's a lot of good work that's gone into that, but that's because he's complied and he's had the good wraparound support. But I wished he'd had that when he was 10.
But actually, he will probably make a really good support worker, youth worker. And if he applies his frame of reference almost like you have, you seem to work more in that trauma-informed, person-centered way, and you're responsive to people's needs. We can't always be that way because sometimes funding dictates, but as much as possible, or letting people know that's how we're sort of responding, is really, really important. Thanks for sharing, Caroline. Someone else applying the window on the world? Either an example of yourself or maybe applying it to someone you've worked with.
This is going to be a bit odd, this.
2 or 3 things. Don't have to go into much detail. So again, we're sort of like thinking about, 1, the risk to young gang members, and the risk of them developing mental health. So maybe choose 1 or 2 things, talk about what might have happened and how that might translate to them experiencing mental health for me. Or yourself, if that's easier.
Go on, I'll say something. This might be a little bit difficult. I'm doing this. I'm I started working in unpaid work because I want to help people.
Okay.
I was diagnosed with complex PTSD 3
Yeah.
years ago. COVID sort of brought it out to me when I was younger. People should have went to jail for.
Yeah.
I recently was working with a young gentleman, and I just noticed that when you've got complex PTSD, you live in a perpetual state of fight or flight.
Absolutely.
And I recognised that in a certain gentleman who was working with, and you know, he caused a lot of trouble on one of our projects, and he was very, very close to being recalled. And I could see this, and then I'd done a little bit of digging and found out he'd been in care, and it was, you know, I don't know where I'm going with this, but basically, I just want to give people a voice because, what you said before about defining mental health to me, bad mental health is a killer.
Yeah.
It ruins every aspect of your life. And you know, I just feel like a lot of the people we work with have got trauma problems, and unless it's addressed, they're gonna keep going round in circles, coming through the criminal justice system till it's addressed.
Revolving door.
A revolving door. Like I had what was called EMDR, I don't know, which is a trauma based, and it changed my life in the space of 18 months to where, you know, I've done various jobs throughout my life, but you know, look where I am now after doing that. And you know, I just want to help give a voice to those people who haven't got a voice, instead of saying they're mad, bad and crazy. Do you know what? They're damaged.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you need
recognizing that, isn't it?
Yeah, they need help.
So the language that we use, particularly when we are supporting young people and writing reports, any sort of data, that will follow them. So you imagine a young person who has maybe gone through some of what you've just explained, Andy, that goes to school, he's beaten up before they leave the house, go to school, get to school, they're a bit late, teacher says something, they're just really frustrated because and potentially depressed because the beatings are happening consistently at home. And just imagine them maybe standing up, the chair being flipped back on the floor because of the way they've stood up, that being put down on a young person's file as aggression or violent behavior, rather than exploring what was going on with that young person, could be something that would follow them for the rest of their life. So it's really important to try to get to the core of, but we don't always have the time to do that and potentially the funding to do that. So the Mental Health Act, are we familiar with it? Mental Health Act, it's an act of parliament that sets out the rights and the scope of the act when legislation is applied to an individual. Someone may be detained on the Mental Health Act under a Section 136, which basically means they can be detained from a public place if they are deemed to be a danger to themselves or to a third party or the general public. So they will go on to answer 6.1 and 6.2, but we will go into more detail in the later criteria and sessions. So a person detained under the Act in certain circumstances has a legal right to appeal a section through a tribunal. So for example, if someone is sectioned or taken from the street under a 136, what might happen is they might be taken to a place of safety, somewhere like the Ollie Esther. When they are there, they may be placed under a Section 2, where they will be put under a section so that they can be assessed. So what the psychologists, the mental health team will be doing is trying to identify, one, if they're known to the system. If they are not known to the system, they'll be looking at their symptoms and trying to give a diagnosis so that they can treat them. They may be administered medication. In some circumstances, the Mental Health Act can allow them to section you and to treat you against your wishes if they deem you to not have capacity. The threshold in terms of sectioning someone is quite high. There was an exception to that during COVID-19 where they were doing frequent changes and it was an unprecedented situation. What they actually did was they made a temporary change to the Mental Health Act where only one practitioner was required to section someone. We'll watch a video a bit later on within the course where it explains the role of an approved mental health practitioner. Normally when someone is being sectioned under the Act, it would normally be an AMP, an approved mental health practitioner, which is probably a social worker trained in mental health. A psychologist, maybe a GP. There's normally 2 or 3 practitioners that would do that. During COVID, it went down to 1 practitioner, which again is kind of unprecedented. So we're gonna have another look at a video. And it's a Carla discussing mental health in music. Young people use a lot of things to explore.
And in the creative world, I always find it really emotionally damaging to those people who they seem to be broken people, but in the industry that they can find they can't say that they have these issues, or they have to have a lifestyle like, I can't get on a train, I have to be seen to not wear the same thing twice. So how do you assess that whole situation, and how can artists kind of like get themselves to be more liberated mentally from that?
This is a very good question. It's very sad because all these people who basically don't give a fuck about the artist, the label, the radio, all of the brands that want to hatch themselves onto you when you're popular, the entire industry really is not set up to serve the artist. And when you look at the pressures artists are put under, particularly artists on major labels, why you're the hot guy. It's like I used to kick ball, right? When I used to play football. If you're playing well, the coach is on you. The youth development officers on you. Everyone loves you. You're the next big thing. You could say whatever you want. You could wear what you want to training. You can have dreadlocks or braids. The moment you're not playing well, you better shave your hair. You better do your tie up proper. You better be disciplined because you're not the guy of the moment. Well, music is quite like that. And unfortunately, the materialism in hip hop, particularly, or the materialism in mainstream hip hop, has created a culture where young men, particularly young black men, particularly, let's be real, are being made to feel by other black men, but by the media that supports them, that they're less if they don't have more than not necessarily any more than anyone else. But I'm looking at what I see. Right, oh, you're broke, you're this, you're that. Well, who are they talking to? They're clearly not talking to the old rich white men that own record labels. And so we have a whole set of aspirations that are unrealistic. And actually, when you think about it, are kind of backwards. If poor people are idiots, then our parents are idiots if we grew up poor. Yeah, so all these expectations feed into artists, I think, often pursuing stuff that they necessarily don't really want. They probably ain't really that shallow as a person. And then once you attain a certain amount of wealth, if you do something that's against your spirit to get that wealth, you're never happy. You think it will be enough because you wanted a Lambo or this or a Bentley or that. And that's where the drugs start to come in. Man start taking drugs and all them thing there, and if can't focus. And if you understand nutrition, I've studied a little bit of nutrition, if your liver's fucked, you're going to be depressed. A lot of people don't understand. Sometimes depression is just toxification of the liver and the kidneys, but the liver particularly, organs have relationships to emotion. That's why when you drink and you mess up your liver, you get emotional. It's not rocket science, right? You detoxify these things and flush the body and your emotions become a bit clearer. But if you're in an environment where drugs are normal, remember in our background, I can't be taking coke in our background. This is what makes me laugh about the rumor of the idea of black people and drugs being so intimately connected. You can smoke weed. And I'm not saying no one takes coke in the ends. Of course they do. But man will be like, rah, bruv, you're a cokehead. Like, it's shameful. You can't come out and admit you take cocaine or you take crack or heroin in a black community because those things are scorned upon. But people are struggling with those problems. And because hip hop is so egotistical, and if you set yourself out in that way, to come out and say, oh, I'm depressed, I'm sad, I'm addicted to drugs, I feel inadequate, I feel like I don't feel neat in my spirit, my label's putting pressure on me, this is happening, that's happening. All of those things are hard things to say, and it takes a lot of humility to say them. And if you build a persona that is based on all the opposite of that, are people going to still respect you and love you afterwards? And so that's why I suppose I feel very fortunate, actually, for a number of reasons, and lots of things that I've never talked about. My early career when I was on the radio, and then my second album and all of that, didn't blow in a particular direction. And actually I look back, and a lot of it was my own fault actually, for other things that were going on behind the scenes. But I look back and I'm like, I feel quite grateful for that, because I feel like if you put me in a certain position at 21, 22 years old, who knows if I'd have been mentally capable of dealing with that, especially because I went to the MTV Awards when I was 17 years old in Barcelona. I went to Puff Daddy's after party as a 17-year-old, obviously because of what my sister was doing. So I was exposed to that world before I was in it, and knew even then, this ain't for me. I went to Nelson Mandela's house when I was 19. Do you know what I mean? when she performed. I don't talk about this stuff, but this is what happened. She performed at the 4664 concert, the concert that he does for his AIDS charity in South Africa. Beyonce was there, Oprah was there, Bono was there. I met all these people. I was a youth man. And I just knew even then, this world isn't for me. I don't belong necessarily in this room, not because I'm any better than anyone in the room, I'm not, but just because I started to understand even then the pressures that were put on artists to conform and to be a certain way. And my sister was one of the few artists that was very lucky who just didn't give a shit. The background we was from, she was just like, I'm going to say what I want to say, I'm going to call Tony Blair the Devil's Chaplain, and I don't really give a damn. I'm going to talk at the Iraq War March, and I'm just going to do me. I'm going to wear my heart on my sleeve and do my thing. And she did that in that period. But I had a tremendous amount of respect for that. So even my view into the industry, I was like, her not giving a shit made her quite unique. And even though I was never on a major label, I felt like I wanted to keep that energy of just not giving a shit and doing my own thing. And I feel like that's what's actually kept me sane. If you're constantly chasing other people's approval, you become a prisoner to their approval. That's not that we don't want to be popular and we don't want people to like our music, but I'm not going to do anything that's against my spirit to succeed. I've been offered big money to do foolishness bare times, or stuff that I consider foolish, to do adverts for this or for that, or just things that I don't agree with. It's not enough money that I can change loads of people's lives. I'm not going to lie to you. If someone said to me, here's 10 mil, the amount of schools I could build and things I would like to think I would do with that kind of money, I'd seriously have to think about it. But if it's 20 grand, 50 grand here and there, that adds up over a period of time, but it's not enough money for, it's personal comfort money to a degree. It's not enough money for me to say, rah, this is really worth people thinking I'm a bit of a plum. Whereas a certain amount of money might be because of what I could do with it, not because I want to quote unquote sell out. And so I think all of those things are really important, and mental health is something that we don't talk about enough.
In the black community as well. In
the black community, yeah. Well, we're massively overrepresented in the mental health institutions, even more so than in the prisons. And again, these are questions we have to ask. Well, why? Either genetically, black people are just more crazy, you know, and we can go with
there are some people.
There's some people who believe that. Yeah. Then if we're going to go with that eugenics-based genetic argument, that would have to be true of every black country in the world. What are the mental health statistics for, I don't know, Botswana or Namibia or African Americans in Atlanta, where most of them are middle class? You know, what are the mental health statistics there? Where I just come back from last week. Obviously, we know black people are not genetically more mental than anyone else. So again, it's not about blame. This is whatever, when you talk about race, even some black people say this foolishness to me, but you can't blame racism. Brethren, if you eat bare McDonald's and you get sick, it's because you're eating McDonald's. That's not an excuse. No one's disputing it's your responsibility to stop eating McDonald's and drinking 2 pints of vodka on the weekend. But if I'm a doctor, I've got to tell you why you're sick, right? And it's the same if a community has a sickness. If poor communities, take colour even out of the equation, in poorer communities, drug addiction affects them worse. Why? Not because poor people take any more drugs than rich people. Because when you're poor and you can't afford drugs, you can't afford your kit, you get stressed, you beat maybe your wife, your children, bad crap happens because everything that was already wrong with you emotionally is made much worse by the fact that you're poor. That you maybe don't have access to education, that you don't have the economic privilege to go rehab and all them kind of things there. And so the drug addiction becomes much more of a problem in poorer communities. Does that make sense? That's not blaming poverty, it's recognising the role that poverty plays. And it's the same with race. So if black communities are more depressed than other communities, we have to look at why. But whenever this is what's funny about this country, you can have racially specific policing, which we've had, right? We've tried it. They've got rid of it now. It no longer is just for black on black violence, right? You can have racially specific media. Black kid does this, black kid does that. Even when Mark Duggan, whose mum's white, was shot, it was black man is shot, right? No problem, cool. But the moment you try and provide a racially specific solution, say, okay, well, if black kids are more depressed and white schools have found, or the major white-run institutions clearly have proved incapable or unwilling to deal with it, someone proposes African-centered education for young black children to deal with some of these mental health issues. Everyone says, reverse racism, you can't do that. But you can have racially specific policing. We can know that there's racial disparities at every level. Hey, lights. At every level of the criminal justice system. But if you propose a racially specific solution, you're a madman.
Interesting. Very interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. So tell me about, you hear him talk about the mental health. Some people thinking it's a black thing. What do we think about that? Do we think it's intentionally a black thing, or the issues that he talked about in terms of intersectionality, the poverty, the race, all those things contribute to poorer communities. Remember we looked at the ACEs? The pair of ACEs?
Yeah, some too.
Salisha first, then Anne.
I do witness personally mental health in Black communities. Yes, I was very fortunate to grow up in the deprived area of Sandwell, Monday to Friday, then Friday to Sunday, middle class white Stratford upon Avon. So I've seen both sides of the circle, and there is mental health issues in the white community as well. It's your experiences that spiral you into mental health issues. So when it comes to the Black community, it's because of some of the things that we've been through that white groups of people do not experience. That's why some Black people go through mental health issues. Mental health issues is not just to one race of people. I don't agree with that at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's something that anyone can experience, because if we are human, we will have mental ill health on a continuum at some degree, whether it's we're happy, getting married, job interview, feeling anxiety, or whether we've been in a road traffic accident and the other extreme. So he mentioned about, you know, you are what you eat, kind of. So talking about the detoxification of the liver and why people detox, what do we think about that? So for every unit of alcohol that we would consume, it takes at least an hour for that to come through your system. Now, if you've got a metabolism where you're eating well, you're maybe exercising or active, then you're roughly going to get that out of your system. But if you think of maybe some of the social media posts where you see the Hennessy, then they've got the cannabis or whatever it is that young people might be indulging in. And if they aren't eating well, maybe not sleeping well because of the anxiety, the stresses that they might have, worrying about retaliation, how might that impact a young person? So remember, we're talking about 1.3, identify relationships between gang affiliation and mental well-being. Do you think that they might utilize cannabis, alcohol more as ways of coping because of their gang lifestyle?
Definitely. It can be like
Definitely.
like we were talking about a little bit before, the trauma that they experienced, or some of the things that they've done themselves, maybe, or had done to them to kind of numb that pain. I know some of the people I work with who have witnessed things or have done things definitely say that, you know, they take that to kind of put themselves in a bubble. To kind of block out that kind of the more traumatic things that they've seen.
He talks about, you know, if it was a racially specific sort of like condition, then you'd have to look at Botswana, Atlanta, places like that. I used to watch a program called something Doctors of Atlanta, I don't know, but a lot of affluent Black professionals. So it's not a case of people can't be of a certain race or professional or understand, but actually the key factors in terms of intersectionality where young people might be excluded, come from poorer backgrounds, maybe might get involved in something to earn money so that they can kind of try and fit in. We taught, who was it that mentioned earlier about peer pressure? Was it you, Steve? Young people trying to fit in terms of peer pressure. All those additional stressors, different layers of intersectionality will impact young people in terms of their mental health and how they cope. So we're going to do another brief exercise before we go into a break. But bear with me. I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to just explore the impact of childhood trauma. So we're going to be specifically looking at 1.2, explaining the risk to young people and young people developing mental health conditions, and also identifying the relationships between gang affiliation and the mental well-being when we explore this slide, all right?
So a lot of the young people that I work with, and I've got to say the majority of them have had childhood trauma, and which has led to anxiety, depression, behavioural exclusion from school, low self-esteem, so don't think they're good enough to go into education or training. They've got no self-worth. They think that the answer is to go with their peers rather than move away, and they don't look at consequential thinking. They don't think of the consequences of their actions. A lot of them self-harm. I've got quite a few people that self-harm because their self-esteem, they don't feel they've got any worth. They don't think that they should be in our society where we are, their words, where I'm not normal, I'm not classed as normal, and I'm trying to focus on what they can do rather than what they can't do. So I will pull out the things that they're good at, like hobbies, interests. They're respectful to me, they've got good manners. So it's just identifying all these little skills that they don't think they have and they don't think they're important, and making them aware of how important it is to move on and to get self-worth, and they don't have to stay in the darkness of crime, etc. Look at hobbies, interests, sports. I'm quite a good advocate on sport. I'm very interested in all sports. And one of the things a lot of them are interested in is football. Well, I'm an Evertonian, so I get loads of stick, but we have a lot of banter, and then there's a bit of connection there. And what I find with a lot of young people that I am working with, that they've never had trust, and I deliver what I say I'll deliver, so they can see that I'm not interested in me. It's not about me. It's not about anything else. This is about them and helping them. And working in prisons with young people is the same. Some of them said, I wished you were my mother, because I'd be trying to encourage them to do things and educate themselves and leave prison with qualifications. Moving, we've had people move from prison straight into university, Salford University, because they've had that. And you can see how intelligent these young people are. They think that they're intelligent. They are. It's just that they've got poor decision makers making decisions, and they're quite angry about the trauma that they've had throughout their young life.
So that anger, you've mentioned anger. So how might that anger display?
Well, it can display by being aggressive to other people, taking it out on other people. Sometimes they don't understand why they feel the way they feel, but they're angry because somebody's got something better than them, and they've had a better opportunity in life and they haven't. So anger, it leads to crime, offences, ended up in front of a judge, possibly into prison. So it's just an escalation from the anger rather than somebody sitting down.
I'm going to stop you there, because you've been comprehensive at answering. You've answered 2 and potentially elements of 1.3 as well, Caroline. So this will be emailed back and your name's next to it. So this is your response. You can build on that. So thank you for that. One more person picking an area, so not mental health. You touched on slightly there, brain development, just where you mentioned that they don't think about the consequences of their actions. We've got a Padlet that I will share with you guys as like just extra resources. And Dr. Andrew Curran is a child brain development sort of like specialist, and he talks his work is just brilliant. But just in terms of the brain development, we know that like the criminal age of responsibility is 10 years old, but actually at 10 years old, young people, just dependent on where they've grown up, are not really going to know the full consequences of being exploited. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? So one more person, please pick a topic for me and let's explore 1.2, 1.3, explaining the risks and identifying relationships.
I was going to go with toying between relationships and emotions. I think there's a lot of crossover with all of these, to be fair. But quite a lot of the young people I work with have had, there's huge attachment issues, huge, for whatever reason, usually something quite traumatic, like either the loss of a parent or for whatever reason being in and out of the care system, but they've just never had that secure attachment. I find then their emotional responses to things. There's obviously, Caroline's touched on a mistrust of people, just a lack of consistency and stability and security in their lives, really, and just never having been shown sort of some really basic things, or been felt that care. I find in that situation, obviously, with even sometimes with myself, they become quite attached to me once they gain that trust. So at the moment, I'm having to move some cases around due to my new role. And actually, there's some people who just really aren't coping well with that. So I'm having to spend a little bit longer in that transition with them. But in terms of for gangs and things like that, some people are looking for that sense of belonging and that warmth that they've maybe not felt that they've got from home.
So let me just ask you, Nikki, if they are looking, oh gosh,
to be easily to exploit.
If they are looking for that sense of belonging, what might they do to fit in?
Whatever is required of them. This is things what makes them vulnerable.
Specific example.
They'll look after maybe drugs or weapons. They will engage in any sort of risky behaviours that their peers who they want to impress or want to kind of not be rejected from that kind of social situation, whatever they really want them to.
What might be the consequences of them doing that in terms of their mental health? So I want you to be specific about some of the things they may experience in terms of mental health.
Scare them, fear. I know it sounds silly, but fear and anxiety. They might feel trapped. I've got a case I work with at the moment, and he's been being exploited since he was maybe about 14. He's now 19, but obviously he's an adult, but it's still happening to him. And when I've suggested about him trying to, look at ways of and trying to suggest ways of getting out, he's like, I can't. He just feels completely overwhelmed and powerless, and that he'll never get out of that. So I think he's lost all hope.
And what are the sorts of things he might turn to cope? Because
he's tried drugs. Yeah, he's tried drugs. He carries weapons because he's scared.
Okay,
but obviously he's coming into the criminal justice system when actually he's engaging things that he doesn't particularly want to do, but he feels he has to do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So that's quite a comprehensive answer as well, Nikki. Thank you very much.